People come into court every day thinking they are bringing me a parking ticket, a landlord dispute, a broken promise, or some petty excuse for bad behavior. Most of the time, they are wrong. They are not bringing me paper. They are bringing me judgment, responsibility, and the consequences of choices they made when nobody was looking. I have said for years that common sense is not so common, and every day in a courtroom proves that point. But every now and then, a case comes in that is not about irresponsibility, greed, laziness, or gamesmanship. Every now and then, someone stands in front of me carrying a kind of pain that no law book can measure and no schedule can accommodate. When that happens, the job is not to perform cruelty in the name of order. The job is to tell the truth, apply the law with intelligence, and remember that justice without humanity is just bureaucracy wearing a robe. That is exactly what happened on a cold morning when a woman walked into court with a parking citation in her hand and grief written all over her face. Before she said a word, I knew this was not the usual story. Courtrooms have a rhythm. You can tell when someone is angry, manipulative, frightened, rehearsed, or simply hoping to talk their way out of a mess they created all by themselves. This woman was none of those things. She looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. She looked like somebody who had been hit by life and had not yet figured out how to stand up straight again. Her clothes were neat, but she wore them the way people wear whatever is closest to them when getting dressed feels like an impossible task. She was holding the citation carefully, almost delicately, as if even a piece of paper had become one more burden she could barely carry. Now, let me explain something. A courtroom is not group therapy. It is not a place where every sad story wipes away every consequence. Plenty of people try that. They come in with tears on demand, excuses lined up like dominoes, and a speech ready to go about why the rules should not apply to them today. I have heard every version of that performance. I do not buy nonsense just because it arrives with emotion attached to it. Feelings are not facts. Sympathy is not a legal defense. If you did something wrong, you generally pay for it. That is how civilized society works. But civilized society also requires judgment. It requires the ability to distinguish between a person gaming the system and a person crushed under circumstances no decent human being would ever choose. Her case was called. She walked forward slowly, and when I looked at her properly, I saw the unmistakable signs of fresh grief. The swollen eyes, the pale face, the slightly delayed responses, as though every word had to travel through fog before it could leave her mouth. I asked for her name, confirmed the citation, and then asked the first important question, what happened? Not, why should I dismiss this? Not, are you guilty or not guilty? I wanted context. The law lives in facts, and facts begin with what happened. She took a breath and told me that the day before the citation, she had buried her husband. They had been married for more than 3 decades. He had been sick for months. Cancer. Fast, cruel, and final. Anyone who has lived long enough knows exactly what that does to a family. It does not simply take a life. It empties rooms, changes language, and rearranges the future in one ugly blow. She explained that the funeral had taken place the previous afternoon. Relatives came, children came, neighbors came, casseroles came, condolences came, and then, as they always do, people left. That is the part nobody talks about. The service ends, the chairs fold up, the flowers droop, and everyone goes back to their own homes, while the person closest to the loss remains behind to face the silence. She said that after everyone left, she tried to sit in the house, but every object in it had become unbearable. His glasses, his robe, his side of the bed, his coffee mug, little things, the sort of little things that become enormous when someone is gone. So in the middle of the night, unable to sleep and unable to breathe in a home that no longer felt like home, she got in her car and drove. She drove past places that had mattered to them over the years. The restaurant where he proposed, the hospital where their children were born, the park where they pushed strollers and later watched grandchildren run in circles. Then she drove to the cemetery. It was early morning by then, still dark enough for grief to feel at home. She parked near the gate because that was as close as she could get. She sat in the car and talked to her husband. I do not know whether everyone understands that, but I do. People speak to the dead because love does not shut off simply because a casket closes. She sat there trying to gather herself, trying to survive one more hour of the first day of a life she had never wanted. When dawn began to break, a parking enforcement officer approached and wrote her a citation because the area was restricted. Now, let us be very clear. I am not saying the officer invented the sign. I am not saying the rules vanished because a sad person arrived. I am saying that human beings are supposed to possess something called judgment. If you see a woman sitting outside a cemetery at sunrise the morning after a funeral, and she is not causing danger, not blocking traffic, not creating a disturbance, then perhaps this is not the moment to behave like a machine with a clipboard. The law gives authority to people, not to robots. When you give authority to people, you expect them to use a brain, a conscience, and some sense. I asked her how much the citation was. $75. Not the largest amount in the world, but that is not the point. Money lands differently depending on the weight a person is already carrying. A $75 citation can be an annoyance to one person and a humiliation to another. In her case, it landed on top of funeral expenses, medical bills, paperwork, exhaustion, and a fresh hole in the center of her life. She was not standing there because she wanted a favor. She was standing there because the system had demanded that a grieving widow show up in court to explain why she had sat outside her husband's grave in the early hours of the morning. That, to me, is where courts earn their legitimacy or lose it. Not in dramatic speeches, not in self-important displays, in moments exactly like that. A judge is not there to prove how powerful the bench is. A judge is there to decide whether the outcome serves justice. Justice is not identical to punishment. Justice is proportionality, reason, and context. It is one thing to fine someone for ignoring clear rules out of convenience or arrogance. It is another thing entirely to punish a widow whose only offense was being too shattered to think like a parking manual. So I asked a few more questions. Was she disruptive? No. Was the vehicle creating a hazard? No. Did she argue with the officer? No. Did she return there repeatedly in defiance of prior warnings? No. This was not a pattern. This was not contempt. This was not disregard for public order. This was grief. And there is an enormous difference between somebody acting out of disrespect and somebody acting out of heartbreak. Too many people confuse toughness with wisdom. They think applying the rule in every possible situation without thought somehow makes them principled. It does not. It makes them lazy. Real judgment requires effort. You have to listen. You have to separate manipulation from sincerity. You have to decide whether enforcing the rule here advances any meaningful purpose or merely adds one more bruise to a person already battered by life. Anybody can say, rules are rules. A child can say that. An adult in authority is supposed to know when the application of a rule stops serving the reason the rule exists. The purpose of parking enforcement is public order and safety. It is not to punish mourners for falling apart quietly in their cars. If the legal system cannot distinguish between those two things, then the system becomes ridiculous. And once the system becomes ridiculous, people stop respecting it. Respect is not built by blind rigidity. It is built when ordinary people believe that the person in charge has enough intelligence to see reality as it is. I looked at her and told her exactly that. I said, you were not out joyriding. You were not shopping. You were not trying to avoid paying for a proper parking space. You were sitting outside a cemetery after burying your husband. That is not criminal thinking. That is grief. You could see the relief in her face even before I finished speaking, because somebody in authority was finally describing the truth instead of hiding behind procedure. Then I dismissed the citation completely. Not reduced, not postponed, not converted into some ridiculous payment plan that would require her to mail in checks while trying to figure out her husband's pension and death certificates. Dismissed. Gone. Because the only sensible outcome was to remove one unnecessary burden from somebody carrying far too many already. What happened next is the part people remember because it was emotional, but emotion was not the reason for the decision. The reason was judgment. The emotion came because she had walked into court expecting another cold official response from a world that had already taken too much from her. Instead, she got common sense. She got recognition. She got told in plain language that what she had done was human, understandable, and undeserving of punishment. She started crying, not theatrically, not to win anything, but the way people cry when they have been bracing for a blow and realize for one brief second that it is not coming. That matters. Do not underestimate what it means for somebody drowning in grief to encounter basic dignity. When a person has been reduced by circumstance to paperwork, appointments, signatures, and fees, being seen as a human being can feel like rescue. I did not bring her husband back. I did not erase her pain. I did not fix the bureaucracy waiting for her outside the courtroom. But I could do one thing in that moment. I could refuse to make her day worse for no good reason. Authority always gives you that choice. You can add weight or you can decline to add it. Now, I know what some people would say. They would say, if you dismiss her ticket, where does it end? It ends exactly where judgment says it ends. That is the answer. Courts are not vending machines. You do not put in a sad story and get out a dismissal. The facts here were extraordinary, specific, and compelling. This was a woman with no record of misbehavior, no benefit gained, no danger created, and no intent to violate anything. She was experiencing a once-in-a-lifetime catastrophe and behaving in a way any decent person could understand. The law has room for discretion precisely because life does not arrive in neat, identical packages. The mistake many officials make is assuming discretion is dangerous. Used foolishly, of course it is. Used honestly, it is essential. Without discretion, the system cannot breathe. It cannot tell the difference between an opportunist and a widow, between indifference and despair, between willful misconduct and human collapse. If all circumstances are treated as identical, then justice disappears and only administration remains. Nobody should confuse administration with wisdom. After the case ended, I thought about the parking officer. I am not interested in turning every mistake into a villain story, but I am interested in standards. When people exercise public authority, even in small ways, they shape the public's faith in institutions. A police officer, a clerk, a code inspector, a judge, a parking officer, every one of them represents the state to the ordinary citizen standing before them. If the citizen experiences only indifference, then the state becomes a cold wall. If the citizen experiences fairness and sense, then the law becomes something worthy of obedience. That is why leadership matters. Somebody needs to say out loud that discretion is not weakness. Compassion is not corruption. Understanding facts in context is not favoritism. It is the job. Public service is not a contest to see who can be the most rigid. It is a responsibility to use limited power properly, not emotionally, not arbitrarily, properly. In the years I have spent dealing with people's disputes, I have learned that most adults do not need lectures nearly as much as they need clarity. Tell them the truth. Tell them where they were wrong. Tell them where the system was wrong. Tell them what happens next. Keep it simple. Keep it direct. That morning, the truth was simple. The widow did not deserve a citation. The system had overreached. The proper remedy was dismissal. Everything else would have been theater. What stayed with me later was not just her sadness. It was the fact that she had come to court at all. Think about that. A woman barely functioning after burying her husband still got dressed, drove in, waited for her name to be called, and stood upright in a courtroom to answer a piece of paper. That is effort. That is discipline in the middle of devastation. People think strength is loud. Very often it is quiet. It is a widow standing at a podium trying not to fall apart while explaining why she sat near a grave at dawn. There is another lesson in that, and it is one I wish more people understood. You do not always know what the person in front of you is carrying. The cashier, the receptionist, the court clerk, the stranger in traffic, the person who seems distracted or fragile.